I listened to your trucker episode last month and it reminded me a lot of my own work experiences. I knew I had to submit a couple of my stories, even if they don't fit that typical trucker narrative. I'm sure you'll be able to use the story somewhere. After high school, I did what all my friends were doing. I enlisted in the Army. This was 2008, wherein I did basic and then went to my specific job training. By the end of that year, multiple units had already been gotten the word they were going to the Middle East, places I'm not even legally allowed to discuss. These were hush-hush missions, getting things done quickly for government entities we didn't even know existed. Little did we know, this was because those entities knew the war was about to end. Extraction was imminent, so lots of these little run and guns were put into place throughout the countries involved. Extraction was actually a big part of our deployment, fresh boots to help get the old ones out, but we were specifically told not to disclose our mission details or location to anyone, ever, for any reason. I've seen the absolute worst of humanity. The war in the Middle East was a never-ending nightmare, a constant reminder of the horrors we're capable of inflicting upon each other. As an 88 Mike, a truck driver in the Army, my days blended together in a haze of dust, diesel fumes, and the constant threat of death. The desert landscape stretched out before me, like an endless grave, punctuated by the occasional FOB, or forward operating base, tiny oasis of relative safety in a sea of grimy chaos. My daily transport duties took me down treacherous roads, through ambush zones and areas with questionable terrain. You'd think it'd get easier, that the familiarity would breed confidence, but it didn't. Every time I climbed into the cab of that truck, my heart raced with anticipation, my senses on high alert for the slightest sign of trouble. The roads were always treacherous, the enemies always lurking, waiting to strike. But it wasn't just the enemy I feared, it was the unknown, the unseen threats that lurked in every shadow, every ditch, every abandoned building. The war had a way of warping your mind, making you see danger everywhere, even when it wasn't there. Sometimes it was there, waiting to pounce, to tear your world right apart. All you could do was react, either kill it or try to find some kind of cover. War is a truly ugly thing, and I have many dark memories I wish belonged to somebody else. Honestly, I thought I'd seen it all, but I was wrong. There was something out there, something that made the war seem like child's play, something that made me question my own sanity, my own humanity. It started with a whisper, a rumor, a hint of something sinister lurking just beyond the edge of our little FOB. And then it began to happen. Raids in the middle of the night. And these folks are clever. They'd rig a DIY mortar tube, then fill that tube with ice. There would be just enough space at the top of the tube for them to set the mortar shell in place, then leave behind the tubes. As the sun beats down on the ice sheathed within that tube, it slowly starts to melt. And as it does, the mortar shell gets closer and closer to the fixed firing pin at the bottom. When all the ice melts and the primer hits the pin, the detonation occurs and sends that mortar shell piping up into the air to rain down upon the FOB and our supply lines. Here's the deal though, the insurgents are long gone by the time we find that mortar position. They set those tubes up at 4 a.m., then disappear into the pre-morning dawn. So when the mortars tag us at 5 p.m. in the afternoon, the attackers have been gone for hours. They're in different cities, sometimes over national borders or hiding out in the hill forts. It's a crazy game of cat and mouse, and one that we can't afford to lose. But back to my story. This was sometime in 2009, in an undisclosed area of American conflict in the Middle East, deep in enemy waters, working to extract soldiers and equipment from various frontline outposts. We just loaded everything up from one of our most trafficked FOBs, which was pretty isolated and out on its own, away from the rest of the network of outposts. Our mission was to break this FOB down to its bare bones, leave all the scraps behind. We were taking a route that wormed along this series of different outposts, half of them already abandoned, so security was hit and miss. Every time the sun went down, it just rearranged the chessboard. One stretch of the road would be safe one day, then the next morning, it'd be littered with IEDs. It was rolling bullshit. The only way out was through. That day is etched in my memory like some kind of scar. We departed from base that was barely holding on, its walls breached and defenses worn thin. The unit was headed for an airfield sandwiched between two combat outposts, a supposed safe haven. But the last few days have been a blur of chaos. Constant barrage of armed insurgent attacks, mortar fire raining down like deadly hail. Our leave was delayed, a tactical move to throw off the enemy schedule. We lingered for a few hours, fine-tuning our vehicles, fueling up, our nerves stretched taut as guitar strings. Finally, we formed up and hit the road, a 3-hour drive through this treacherous terrain. Villages and townships gave way to endless dunes, the landscape shifting like a snake, slithering through the sand. Crowds of locals watched us depart, their faces a blur of curiosity and hostility. We knew that half of them were undercover enemies, waiting to relay our movements to all the insurgents. It was a risk that we couldn't avoid, but it still made my skin crawl. As we rolled out, the tension was palpable. Every eye scanned the horizon, every ear strained to pick up the slightest hint of danger. Our convoy was a slow-moving target, a snake winding its way through this hostile territory. I gripped the wheel of my truck, my knuckles white with tension, my heart racing like a jackrabbit. The villages gave way to open desert, the sun beating down on us like a drunk step-parent. Every rock, every dune, every cluster of scrubby trees seemed to hide some kind of potential threat. I felt like I was driving through a minefield, and I guess that's because I was. Every mile a ticking time bomb just waiting to explode. The radio crackled with static, voices of my comrades a steady hum of reassurance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unblinking eyes were trained on us from somewhere out in the shadows. The air was thick with anticipation, almost seeming to vibrate with tension. We knew we were all sitting ducks, a slow-moving target waiting to be picked off. And then, the silence was broken, the stillness shattered by a faint hum on the horizon. "We got some company," the lead scout relayed back to us. "Go ahead," the commanding sergeant barked back. "This looks like farmers, 2 crowds east and west of the roadway, 40 meters out, don't appear to be armed." We all got frosty as the order came down the pipe. Everyone look alive, weapons ready. Be prepared for unfriendly activity. Just as I looked away from the road, an explosion rocked the cab of my truck, filled the windshield with dust and debris. Flames curled around the hood as the explosion mixed with the combustion engine underneath it, effectively frying all the mechanisms that kept the truck running. Next, I could hear that catastrophic pop and hiss, fall the tires as they succumbed to the heat, one at a time. "You all right up there?" Gunny hollered at me from the back of the truck. It was mostly an equipment load, so it was just myself and 2 other guys. Apparently, I'd taken the worst of the blast and had gone into shock for several minutes. Gunny, whose name was Calvin, had been yelling at me for a while. He and I knew each other pretty well from our time out in the desert. "Yeah, you guys intact back there?" I asked, looking back into the smoke contents of my truck. The crates of ammo, ACUs, everything was scattered and blown open, spilling all over. I guess the entire truck tilted hard and had rocked back and forth a bit, all in a matter of seconds. The IED that we ran over had packed a serious punch, but fortunately had only damaged our truck. The rest of the convoy remained undamaged. "We're all good, let's get the fuck out of this thing before it blows," the other guy said, a PFC named Hamlin. We did exactly that and scurried out of the windows as fast as we could. Most of the doors had been locked up from the sudden blast. We got out to find the rest of the convoy parked along the road, all the drivers nervously eyeballing every inch of dirt before them. They knew what I knew. If there was one IED in the dirt, there were definitely 100 more to follow. I looked at the caravan, stretched out in front of us. It went on for at least a quarter of a mile. They were entrenched in God knows how many explosives. We sat idle like that for a while. A couple of medics came back to check on us, gave us the clear, and then went back to the security of their rigs. The sergeants were parlaying with the commanders back at the airfield, trying to figure out the next move since our truck had been sidelined. A couple of mechanics came over to look at the damage, but told us right away that we weren't outfitted to make any kind of repairs. It needed to be hauled back to base before they could fix anything. Now behind us, with their backs to the sun, the group of farmers was steadily growing into a large audience. I knew it'd only be a matter of time before shit would hit the fan. It was always just a footfall away out here. Soon we saw some officer pricks striding back to us. He looked smug, and I don't know why, but it just put a bad taste in my mouth. "What's the word?" Calvin hollered over to him before he could open up his mouth. "Brass wants us back to Bagram before sundown. We gotta go right now to meet that deadline." I looked back at the truck. What about us? "How many in the vehicle?" "Just 3 of us," Calvin explained, a look of agitation spreading quickly across his face. "Looks like you 3 drew the short straw. You get security detail until we can get this piece of shit back to base," he said, with that same smug smile. "Who's driving anyway?" I raised my hand. "You 2 can blame this dipshit," he said, as he pointed a finger at my chest. "Lesson learned. Watch where the fuck you're going." I didn't bother to explain myself. We all knew that IED had been buried under a foot of sand. There was no way to just spot a bomb, especially if they took the time to hide it. I just smiled, nodded, and took the rest of the orders. It turned out we weren't that far from the combat outposts, only about 30 minutes. This area had been cleared on and off the last few days, so the commanders were calling it secure for now. The plan was to let the convoy roll onward, while Calvin, Hamlin, and I took up the lead and guarded the truck I accidentally blew up. As I mentioned before, it was full of claymores, bullets, and all kinds of tools for war. Letting it fall into insurgent hands just simply was not an option. Still, the commanding officers had a feeling this was all a distraction, so wanted to get the rest of the soldiers and equipment off the roadway and into a secure location of the airfield. And we couldn't blame them. The 3 of us were to just sit tight until a team returned with relief and a hauling truck. ETA, 90 minutes. We sat in stunned silence as the rest of the convoy just rolled onward, each soldier looking out to us in disbelief as they went by. Some waved, most of them just turned forward to look, happy not to be the ones left behind. A couple of people offered to stay, but command was keen to get everyone off the road and back to the airfield. Soon they were out of sight, just a cloud of dust inching through the desert like something out of Dune. The sun started to dip and fade away, creating a blinding glow over the horizon. I was in the truck, up through the top hatch with an eye in every direction. Hamlin sat on the hood, literally baking himself away in the relentless weight of the sun. Calvin stood in the back, where there was this sliver of shade to protect him. We had eyes forward, eyes backward, and my eagle's nest to catch anything on the sides. For the first half hour, nothing really happened at all. It wasn't until twilight settled that the shadows got real long and squirrely. This was probably 45 minutes in, or halfway into our little security job. And this is when shit usually got the realest, as pursuit of insurgents through the desert in the dark was almost impossible, even if you had a vehicle. The hills and gulches are just too rugged, too complex to keep up. The only way to successfully give chase is if you have some kind of drone. "Oh shit," Hamlin muttered. "Eyes up." I turned in the direction he was looking, forward, the same direction the caravan went. Way out there, maybe a mile away, we could see a group coming and climbing out of the gully, onto the road. Considering how dark it was, there must have been 30 or 40 of them, climbing up and turning back to pull the others up behind them. There was no way to tell if they were armed or not, but after assembling in the road, they quietly began to approach. "Calvin, get up here," I said over my shoulder. "I see him," he explained. He'd already come around the side of the truck, rifle trained directly at the approaching group. He had a much better scope than either Hamlin or I did, so he had a better bead on them. It wasn't infrared or anything, but definitely allowed him to get a better angle on whatever was going on. "They have bags," he explained. "Of what?" "Fuck if I know. Candy, donuts?" He shot back sarcastically. "Can you 2 shut the fuck up?" Hamlin requested. It was funny to hear the PFC call the action, as he was totally right. We settled into the shadows of our transport truck and just waited. It was really all we could do, barrels fixed on the group slowly coming toward us. Hushed voices spoke in dialect I didn't know, the strange alien tongues getting closer in the dark. "Fuck this, get on the horn," Calvin instructed, pointing up into the cab. "Hurry up." I dropped through the hatch and into the driver's seat, clicked through a couple of channels and static and feedback until I hit the airfield. Good old Americans were talking back and forth in a language that I did know. Bagram Airfield. This is Delta Leave Behind. We're 30 minutes south of the Twins. Combat Outpost 212 and 213. Extraction team is supposed to be here in 30 minutes, but we need guns on site immediately. Delta Leave Behind, this is Bagram. What's your situation? It's too hard to tell. There are bogies in the road approaching our position. From which direction? Approaching from the north side. They're walking right at us, I said. Copy that. Be advised the rendezvous team has already left, but we'll request they get there with their quickness. I took a shaky breath and looked back through the windshield. They were almost close enough to start shouting. What should we do? Hold fire. We've got something on the way over. ETA? I asked. 60 seconds. I hung up the radio and crawled back through the roof hatch. I could hear it all up there now. Shuffling feet, the sound of fabric on fabric, and dozens of chattering voices. All three of us were feathering the triggers, ready to spray down range at the first sign of lethal contact. Hold up! Hamlin hollered through the dark at them. Stop right there! The group stopped, but continued to whisper just out ahead of us. All civilians, please turn around and return to the village, Calvin shouted. He had this deep, authoritative voice, and honestly sounded like a cop or a drill instructor, but still, he was speaking a different language. None of them moved to follow his commands. Right at that moment, the most unbelievable sights of my entire life happened. A massive beam of light dropped down out of the sky, almost like a UFO. I mean a thick, wide cylinder of 10,000 lumens, lighting up every inch of space for a good 50 feet. We could see their faces, their clothes, every little detail under that unwavering glow. It was a drone, dispatched from the airfield. That was what the guy had implied over the radio comm. I only guessed because what else could get here in 60 seconds? It had to be something in the air, and based on the totally silent presence, it couldn't be a helicopter. The crowd froze up underneath the light, and now they could see that we were armed. They made themselves clear. Those holding bags came to the front of the crowd and dropped to their knees, emptying the contents of the bags for us to see. They brought food, water, and tools of all kinds. They were good people, good locals from a village nearby. Word had passed through the community that an American truck was down, damaged by an IED. Some of them got together, got a care package of food and water for us, and all the tools they could scrounge up to help us fix our machinery. In that moment, I felt nauseous, but overwhelmed with relief. The phantoms in the dark turned out to be friendly after all. By the time extraction got there, they found us lounging on blankets in the dirt, eating all manner of fresh food with those villagers. They helped us load everything up and wished us well on our travels. To the rural villagers out there in the Badlands, thanks for the support. This story isn't mine, but one my grandfather used to tell me when I was growing up. We lived in rural New Mexico, where the land stretches out like a canvas of dust and rock. Our family made a living doing the work others didn't want to do, cutting highways, ranch handling, working for electrical companies. We were the go-to people for jobs that required a strong back and a willingness to get our hands dirty. My grandfather Dale was a man of all trades. He could fix a broken engine, wire a house, hunt a deer with ease. He was a true Renaissance man, and I looked up to him with a mix of awe and reverence. One summer, he came home with a story that would haunt me for years to come, though. A logging company had rolled into town overnight, like a ghostly apparition. The strange thing was, there wasn't much forest to speak of in our area. Dale was curious and applied to be a truck driver for that company. To his surprise, they hired him on the spot, along with a few other locals to fill the swing shifts. The company was well outfitted, with a shiny new equipment and a crew of men who seemed to know their business. But there was something off about them, something that made Dale's skin crawl. They worked 24 hours a day, round the clock, and would only be in the area for a week. The pay was incredibly high, but the hours were weird and the atmosphere was tense. Dale would come home exhausted, his eyes sunken in and his face drawn. He'd tell stories of the logging camp, of the men who worked there, and the strange occurrences that happened in the dead of night. I was young, but I could sense the unease in his voice, the feeling that something was just waiting beyond the edge of town, watching and waiting. As the days passed, Dale's stories grew more ominous, more sinister. He spoke of strange noises in the woods, of lights flickering in the darkness, of this unshakable feeling of being watched. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew my grandfather wasn't one to spin tales for the sake of it. Something was definitely wrong. I could feel it in every fiber of my body. My parents naturally started taking these conversations into other parts of the house. They didn't want the kids hearing all the cuckoo stuff coming out of Grandpa. Soon enough, that week came to an end. Grandpa's stint with the loggers was over. His stories and anxious behavior went away, and for the most part, I forgot all about that weird little summer. At least until I got older. I must have been 20 or so, having a beer with my family when someone piped up and brought it all crashing back into my head. "Hey, you remember that summer, Dale, when you worked for the Men in Black?" He laughed, but I could see in his face that he had some memories coming right back to him as well. I made a mental note to touch back on that in private to see if I could get the actual whole story, and I did. Grandpa was almost too excited to share it, even if it was only to get it out of his mind. Maybe to archive it with someone other than himself, who knows. It went exactly as I explained. A logging company came to town and Grandpa applied. Again, no real forest around here, not to yield real lumber anyway. That was the first red flag. The guy he went and applied with clearly didn't work for a sawmill of any kind. High and tight haircut, pressed black suit, extremely fit underneath his clothes. He looked military plain as day, but Grandpa just chalked it up to getting out of the trade. Military men got into other jobs all the time, it wasn't a big deal. Then he saw the equipment the next day. Every single piece of it was brand new, freshly oiled. He said the trucks, the backhoes, the tree pushers, none of it had ever been used. They all had that new car smell, brand new paper license plate taped to the back. But the digits were clearly bullshit. They were all the exact same numbers and letters. They didn't have an expiration date. Grandpa just assumed this must have been a bid job. Some company got the contract and had to allocate all their logging equipment overnight. Either way, he was getting paid big bucks to simply just drive back and forth. He'd get on site right at midnight for his nightly truck inspection. While he did that, the shift from earlier would be running semi after semi out of the loading zone, which was entirely private and fenced off. In fact, the entire facility was apparently top secret, as my grandpa and the other hired drivers weren't allowed anywhere but the truck stalls outside the fence. There were armed guards walking patrols by the gates, jeeps that did laps of the entire perimeter, ready to fly to the scene at the smallest sign of trouble. The only thing I can compare it to are the videos that I've seen of Area 51. My grandpa's description is eerily similar. Rolling badlands, tall barbed wire fences, military types lingering about. Everything done behind a fence and or under the cover of darkness. Everything felt weird all the time. No questions ever got answered. What's in the back of the trucks? Don't worry about it. What are we hauling today? It's above your pay grade. What forest are you guys logging? And that one was just met with some kind of stifled laughter. For Grandpa, this was shit sticking to the bowl. Everything inside him telling him to get the hell out of there, and fast. But the money kept him behind the wheel of that truck though. When the last shift was done, the overnighters waited by the gate for their cargo to roll out. The entire overnight crew were all local hires, whereas the crew that rolled out before them was entirely private, guys in uniforms with crew cuts. And the word was that all of them wore a gun on their hip. Pretty serious stuff for just driving a big rig. The cargo would come and go at one time. These just massive white stock semi-trailers, the same ones that were seen on the highway all the time. They'd get everyone attached, then they'd begin the trip over to the processing facility, about 2 hours west of us, which honestly was a head scratcher in itself. There wasn't really shit out that way, except for the Chaco Canyon area, another armpit of nothingness. It was all really weird, but none more so than when they got on the road. The entire overnight caravan had an armed security detail, a couple of cars in front and 2 trucks in the back. Grandpa only knew they were armed because he peeked in one of the cabs when they were passing him one evening. He could see a pair of M16s crisscrossed over the console. The driver and passenger both wore what looked like bulletproof vests. Another big red flag for Grandpa. Then they started seeing the lights. It happened every single night that they drove, every night for a week. After they got well outside the borders of our little community, there was actually be some sparse woodland scattered around the valley. There would be just some flashes at first, some strobing orbs way out in the distance. They'd be interrupted by the trees, making it harder to see and track. Grandpa said that they were the brightest, whitest lights he'd ever seen, like the sun had emptied out its pockets out there in the woods. The lights would dance around each other, start to play chase, then almost seem to try to blink a code over to the drivers. And no one asked when they got back to the processing facility. It was just this unspoken thing off the road. Don't ask, don't tell. They knew it had something to do with their cargo. It made everyone pucker up real good, and those orbs would zip up into the sky, one after the other, till the woods went dark and still again. Never saw anything else like it in his life. No sir, Grandpa had said. When he talked about the lights, he got real antsy and jittery. Could tell they had him shaken up still, all these years later. Of all the things he actually saw, those were likely the most inexplicable. Sometimes there would be people standing along the highways, business-looking types wearing suits and ties. Some would even have briefcases. They didn't hold out a hand for a ride or anything, just watched the procession of semi-trucks crumble on down the highway. Most of them were expressionless, but the ones that did have a face looked joyous, he said, happy or satisfied or something. And a few of them almost looked like they were in shock. They drove by and that was that. Just some stranger out on the road at 2 a.m. without any kind of car. As you can imagine, this was another red flag for my grandpa. Each night that they would arrive at the processing facility, which had a long winding driveway that went on for about 3 miles, sneaking into some canyon. At the back of the driveway was this huge bay door built right into the side of a mountain. It would roll up and the semi would proceed to drive underground. The receiving workers explained to Grandpa that it was an old mine, converted into a storage facility, but he couldn't remember any mines in that part of the valley. Whatever the case, they backed the trailers into the holding stalls, unhooked the load, then rolled out of that cavernous maw, back to the surface. He said the place that was underground was huge, sprawling roadways of unimaginable size. Some areas as wide as 80 feet, others as tall as 100. Absolutely massive tunnels that went in every direction, to crazy depths that Grandpa couldn't even begin to fathom. The whole thing made him claustrophobic, like he'd been allowed a window into what an anthill is like. They would reattach the empty trailers, then begin the long slog back home. Drop off with the loggers was at 7 a.m. Have their truck inspected and checkout finished shortly after that. Grandpa would roll in the door sometime around 8 a.m, wide-eyed and full of crazy stories. This is where the initial memories begin. Grandpa and his buddies would roll around theories for the next 20 years in the bars and back shops, usually over a beer. Some of them had also driven a truck for that strange logging company all those years ago. Fellow specters in the night, watching all that weird shit go by the wayside. There was one thing they all put together. The trucks themselves didn't have any markings of any kind, neither did the trailers. No company name was one thing, but they were free of any kind of reflector or strip of paint. Stock white with rivets, that's it. Now, you go look at another stock white trailer, and you see something that legally has to be on there, the length of the trailer. For example, is painted in small numbers along the side. There's usually a serial number of some kind or unit number. Something, anything. Grandpa's trucks only had one thing on them. It was a weird symbol stamped onto the back door of each one, low, near the corner. It looked like some kind of Masonic symbol, definitely strange, not something you'd ever recognize. It didn't have words or anything, just a circular symbol that looked old, religious, or something. None of them ever saw that marking again. They only ever saw it on the trucks. After that week was up, all the equipment moved on, and no one ever heard of a logging contract coming through the county again. My grandpa went to the grave never knowing what it was he was hauling. People over the years have offered some reasonable theories. Nuclear waste is the biggest one. Back in those days, there was a lot less regulation, lots of experimenting too, so I guess anything is possible. Grandpa, on the other hand, didn't want to hear anything like that though, on account of the lights and those people on the road. He believed it was something much more diabolical, but at the end of the day, no one had any proof. All I can tell you is this wasn't long after Roswell, and there were lots of whispers in the wind about weird stuff here, weird stuff there. For a week, I think my family was right in the thick of it. I was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, delivering and installing machines for the company that I was working for. I was in a 26-foot box truck with 12 machines in the back. I was having trouble with the truck that day before. I had checked it out by the rental company, and they told me that it was all good. Since I was behind schedule due to the truck and problems with the installation, I decided to drive late to my next destination. It was about 11 o'clock at night on a state route through the Upper Peninsula. There were no streetlights. There was no other cars. The headlights from my truck were the only thing illuminating the road. I was creeped out at the peak of feeling like I was in the middle of nowhere, and that's because I was in fact in the middle of nowhere. Every single light on the dashboard of the truck lit up, and then it stalled. Now it's pitch black. I'm stopped. The truck isn't restarting. Rather than eat up the battery trying to turn it over, I shut everything down and start making some phone calls. I sat there in the dark making calls, with the only light being from my hazard lights. I looked up and saw something move in the front of my truck, just out of the distance of the flashing lights. I thought it was my imagination at first, but in the moment, I finally got somebody on the other line. They told me it would be at least 2 to 3 hours before they could get a mechanic out to me. So now I'm just sitting in silence. The only noise is the clicking of the hazard lights. I'm staring out the windshield into the void of the darkness when I see that same movement again. Just as I was about to shit my pants from the shadow, my phone rang out, and that nearly secured the pants shitting, because it did scare the hell out of me. It was the mechanic. He wanted me to get out, open the hood, and check some things out. No, I'm not getting out of the truck. Gave him an explanation as to why. He was irritated, but I didn't care. Again, I see the movement just out of range of the lights. I threw on the headlights with the high beams immediately. The headlights caught 3 wolves, snacking on something that looked to be roadkill. I honked the horn and they looked at me like they were irritated more than scared. I was safe. The wolves were more than likely weren't going to bother me, but it was just spooky knowing they were out there. So I shut the lights off. I sat there listening to the flashers click, all while surfing my phone. Each time I would turn the lights back on, the wolves would still be out there. Again, to remind you, I'm in the middle of nowhere. No homes, no businesses, nothing but trees, wilderness, the wolves, and me. Suddenly I heard what I can only equate to a woman's scream of terror, and then it sounded like it came right from behind my truck. Then something slammed into the side of my truck, hard enough to rock it. I wasn't afraid of it actually tipping over, but whatever had hit it hard enough to rock the suspension and move me around in the cab. And this was a heavy truck. I turned every light that I had on, slipped it into reverse so the reverse lights came on, and laid on the horn. I was checking both mirrors. The only thing that I saw was a shadow bolt across the road. I couldn't make out what it was, but in my head, it was this werewolf yeti Bigfoot monster lizard. It was going to end my life. I now noticed the wolves were gone too. And from every nature documentary I've ever watched, the only time predators leave food is when there's a bigger, badder predator around. By this time, I was in full Bobby Hill, that's my purse, I don't know you mode. Whatever had crossed the road didn't cross very far off the road. I could hear it thrashing around in the brush, breaking sticks and what sounded to be logs. There was no other noise pollution. I only had my window cracked a little bit, and I could hear it all pretty well. I basically had the steering wheel gripped, all the lights on, and was feverishly looking out the windows and through the mirrors just to make sure nothing was around in my immediate area. I couldn't see anything off the road, and any flashlight I had was in the back of my truck in my tool bag. I'd physically have to get out of the truck to get them. Finally, I saw some headlights through one of my mirrors, and it seemed like it took hours for them to close the distance to me. The noise stopped as the headlights approached. It was obviously the mechanic because no one else was stupid enough to come out there besides me. He pulled off in front of me. My headlights were shining on him in his truck. His door opened to step out, and then we both hear that same woman screaming in terror noise. The brush thrashing intensified. Whatever it was is close and still pissed. His door immediately shut and my phone rang next. He called my phone asking me what that was, and he sounded almost more panicked than I did. I had no clue what it was, and he had no clue what it was. He ended up calling the police, and he refused to work on my truck until we could secure the immediate area, which, again, I don't really blame him. I didn't want to, so couldn't blame him for not wanting to. He didn't like the idea of him getting out of his truck just to check things out. Eventually, 2 Michigan State police officers showed up. They lit that area up like it was a stadium, and I finally stepped out of the truck for the first time since it's all started. We heard that scream 3 more times while the mechanic was working on my truck, but thankfully it was getting further and further away. The cops had no clue what it was either, and they got kind of spooked too. The obvious answer is a mountain lion, but this isn't really mountain lion country. They are incredibly rare across the state. They were hunted to extinction in like the 1900s. People say there's a few left, but I don't know anyone who's actually seen one in this area. The other thing is, a mountain lion wouldn't just run into the side of my truck. They're smart, agile predators, and running full sprint into a trailer doesn't really fit the bill. It was like I decided to park right in the middle of some kind of encounter that was already going on. The wolves, the screaming entity, the thing that slammed into the truck. It was a lot of nope, and it was all right outside my window. The mechanic finally got my truck running, and I made it to my hotel for the night. The next morning, I walked the truck for inspection. The side that was hit, there was a clear indentation about the size of a basketball. Whatever had hit it didn't hit it hard enough to push all the way through, but definitely mushed the fiberglass. That indentation was about 7 foot off the ground. Again, not very mountain lion-like, but who knows? I have no idea what it was, and I probably never will. I do confidently know that I will never ever drive through that upper peninsula at night, ever again though. I stopped driving over the road due to the lifestyle, and still kept my CDL for other jobs. This all was during the late 90s. I worked for a company that owned a Caterpillar D9 bulldozer. It weighed over 100,000 pounds. It wasn't common for them to move the dozer off the property, but they had the means to do so. Their means to do it was a 1980-something International tractor with a drop trailer. Both were bought specifically to move the dozer. Both had seen much better days. Both were functional and as safe as they could be. They were just used hard. The tractor had a couple of 100,000 miles on it, but that isn't odd for older tractors. We hadn't used the dozer to its full potential for a while, so the owner of the company had lent it out to one of his partners. I was basically hired to operate earth-moving equipment. My truck driving experience was just a perk. They asked me to deliver it, and I agreed. We load up the dozer, secure it to the trailer, and I was on my way. The CB antenna hadn't been tuned in forever, so I was only picking up short range with a lot of static. Weather conditions were cold, with light snowfall, reports of ice on the road in certain areas. I slapped the oversized load banner on the dozer, and off we went. One of the intersections on the state route that I was on was notoriously bad. The intersection is at the base of a hill. If you're coming from the side of the hill it's on, you don't see the stoplight or stop traffic until you get over the peak of the hill, and you still usually would have plenty of room to stop. As I was approaching this intersection, the CB lit up. and a guy was basically screaming into it for traffic at the peak of this hill to slow down. That problem? My CB wasn't tuned. Reception was sketchy. I only caught about every third word. I know the intersection, so I let off the accelerator when I peaked the hill, mostly because I hated and still hate that intersection. I would have plenty of time to stop even with the road conditions, if traffic was normal. Unfortunately for me, traffic was not normal. There was a fresh, pretty bad accident at that intersection. Traffic had backed up more than halfway up the hill. The accident had just occurred, so there was no emergency services on scene yet. I now had very little space to stop a very heavy load with a very old truck. I start downshifting and braking, realizing I was going to be cutting it very close, and then started braking harder. Then I realized that I was hitting this large ice patch along the road. The tires were slipping and jerking the tractor around. It suddenly dawned on me there was no possible way for me to stop this much weight under these conditions. I heard the fifth wheel clanking, and I felt the trailer tugging at the tractor in this weird way. So I looked out my driver's side mirror and didn't see anything, including the dozer. In a panic, I whipped my head around to look out the passenger mirror, and the only thing that I saw was the entire side profile of the trailer and dozer. I'd made a terrible mistake in letting that trailer get out from behind me. It was one of those, well, this is it. This is how I die moments. I was now jackknifing while still moving and still trying to slow the truck down while on an icy hill. I was headed for an intersection full of stopped passenger cars. My truck weighed a lot. At this point, I was thoroughly convinced I was about to involuntarily murder a bunch of people. I laid on the horn as much as I could, but I was also trying to work the steering wheel in an attempt to pretend I had control. Honestly, I hit a point where I basically realized I was just a passenger standing on a brake pedal. I didn't have enough room to correct anything, so I just went all out on that horn. The trailer tires finally heated up enough to start making a very loud and deep squeal. There was a bunch of people in front of me that got out and ran away from their cars. They were staring at out-of-control death roaring down a hill. The truck finally came to a stop within 3 feet of the last car in the intersection. I could sit on my truck's bumper and easily put my feet up on that next car's bumper. The truck stopped with the trailer jackknifed, so I was basically blocking both lanes and the breakdown lane. I was sweating and shaking from all the anxiety. The truck's brakes, the trailer's brakes, and everything underneath was a hair away from catching fire. That's how hot I'd ridden it down, till the last splitting second, all brakes and friction. If I'd gone 10 more feet, I'm confident every single wheel would have sparked a flame from that heat. I was sitting in the now stopped truck. The people who'd abandoned their cars were now screaming at me and pointing up the hill. I looked up the hill to see another driver, but this was a tank trailer, basically reliving everything that I just had, with much less space to work with due to my trailer blocking more of the road. Immediately, I got out of my truck and ran. That's all I could do. I thought I'd escaped certain death, and here I was rehearsing for part 2, not but 10 seconds later. To say it was surreal was an understatement, especially when you're running alongside people you almost just accidentally killed. The second truck slid down and stopped parallel parked almost perfectly with mine. Once his truck stopped, I could see he was experiencing the same thing that I did. We were both extremely close to being in bad accidents. Thankfully, he was pulling a dry tank, and I'm pretty sure that's the only reason he was able to stop. He was a lot lighter than me. By this time, the guy had gotten on the CB and got through enough truckers at the top of the hill that they basically slowed everybody else down. Once the adrenaline wore off, I almost passed out. I've operated a lot of different vehicles in my life, and that situation was easily the scariest operating situation I've ever lived through. I had zero control of that situation, and that's a bad feeling for an operator. I remember the people that ran away from their cars were comforting me. It's been over 20 years since that happened. I still get the willies when I think about it. I've saw enough accidents to know how that could have turned out too. Had I not been able to get that truck to stop, I would have ripped through all those passenger vehicles with little resistance. Another 5 miles per hour, or just being in a different lane, maybe a bit more ice, even the time of day, would have completely changed the outcome of that situation. It would have all entirely been my fault too. and I could have kissed my whole life goodbye. Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to our email or submit it to our subreddit. You can stalk me on Instagram and you can stalk me on Twitter. All these links are below. What's going on, everybody? My plan for this week is to continue to make up for taking a full week off for a couple of weeks ago. Plan on doing 3 episodes this week as well. We got Truckers, obviously, today, and then Desert Stories and Summer Camp Stories for the remainder of the week. And I also wanted to give a specific shout out to the dude that sent in that first story. I appreciate you sending that in, man. That was a good one. That was a fun one. I also was in Afghanistan, not in 2008, but in 2012 for about a year. I was 13 Bravo, so I shot artillery and we rigged up howitzers and went out to help troops and ticks and stuff like that. I've definitely have some, not quite exactly like your story, but I've got seen and had some wild fucking experiences over there. So I just wanted to give a specific shout out to you as well, brother, and thank you for your service. I'd like maybe someday in the near future, maybe not even near future, we could do some kind of meetup. I'd love to do a meetup, like, you know, have a couple beers and share some war stories or whatever. But I mean, honestly, speaking of that, I've talked about it with a couple of other narrators. Like I'd be down and would love to do like a full on, maybe, I don't think there's exactly a narrators convention that doesn't happen, like, but me even just like have a meetup at a horror convention or something like that, you know, that'd be pretty sweet. Be pretty cool. Meet some of you guys and or whatever. But yeah, again, thanks for sharing that story, brother. I appreciated that. I appreciate it. It was a good one. I enjoyed reading that one. And again, I think I did this a couple episodes ago, but if you've got a scary story or true scary story, I guess for all you skeptics and sleuths out there, those that know and can tell the difference between what's real and what's not, allegedly true scary stories, because it kind of goes without saying that any story that gets told on this channel is allegedly true. It's not full on true, because I have no way of verifying and, you know, validating. I think honestly I'm going to put out a Stories for Sleep episode probably tomorrow. Then what is it? Thursday will be either Desert Stories or Summer Camp episodes, Summer Camp Stories, and then Friday will be the other one. All right. So there'll be a total of 4 releases this week, but obviously the Stories for Sleep, most of you know this already, but I'll just reiterate it again, are all duplicates, episodes or stories that you've heard before. It's just putting all the episodes into one for people that like to use them for sleep, because I think it's been a little while since I've done one of those. So yeah, we'll definitely do another one of those. And I'll see you tomorrow for Stories for Sleep, Wednesday for Desert or Summer Camp, and then Friday for the other one. All right. Cheers, guys.